Hello, I'm Joanna Wolf, and in this session, Maria Fewer and I will be presenting a model of how we've integrated teamwork and writing instruction in STEM classes at our university. We have three main goals for this session. First, we want to illustrate how team writing can be a part of WAC instruction. Then we want to introduce a model for the flipped WAC workshop, where a writing expert delivers instruction in a disciplinary class. And by flipped workshop, I mean replacing a class lecture with at-home activities, so in this case, assigning homework, so that class time, when we meet with the students, can be spent in active learning, and in this case, group activities. And finally, we want to share our resources with you. So let me give you a little bit of context. The Global Communication Center, prior to having its funding cut during the pandemic, was a writing center and writing in the disciplines outreach and instruction resource. In addition to providing one-on-one individual writing consultations, we performed over 80 instructional WAC workshops in classes and programs per year. Of these, one of our most popular was the Team Communication Workshop. And here are just a few of the programs where we implemented this workshop, often with writing instruction in these applied disciplines where writing is collaborative as part of the norm. And just to give you a sense of the national landscape in which this instruction is recurring, this graph is from the National Bureau of Economics Research, and it categorizes job descriptions by the type of skills that they require. As you can see here, the most growth in the economy is in jobs that require social skills, which outpaces jobs requiring analytical skills, though the highest growth is in jobs that combine high math or high analytic skills and high social skills. And this makes sense because in a complex world, you need to coordinate with others and be able to gain information from others. But even while employers believe that teamwork is essential and collaboration is essential, only a minority of them agree that our graduates are well prepared in this area. Very similar finding occurs when we ask the employers specifically about communication. But this lack of preparation in teamwork can be seen in student projects themselves. In a study that Elizabeth Powell and I did, surveying over 650 engineering students, over 85% of them reported a problem in a team project in the past year. What's worse, though, is that when we broke these down into the types of problems that students were experiencing, we found that these team projects were reproducing some of the historical inequities that our profession is committed to overcoming. So here is the data broken down by gender. As you can see, slacker teammates. A slacker is a team member who is perceived as not contributing their fair share to the team projects. So slacker teammates were the most commonly reported problem for both genders. But when we look at these last three here, we see that women reported these significantly more often than their male peers. A domineering teammate is a teammate who dismisses, interrupts, silences, or belittles other people's contributions, not allowing everybody to have an equal say into the direction of the project. Limited learning refers to that many of the students we surveyed felt that they were limited by the type of role that they had been assigned on the team, and that they would have learned more had they been assigned a different role. And we can see that 40% of the women felt that they had been on a project where they were excluded from the main work of the team. Now, when we break this data down by ethnicity and look at underrepresented minorities, the patterns become even worse. And we see that Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans report even more of these types of very negative experiences. So I'd like now to invite you to reflect on how these problems occur and how we might minimize these problems. And I'm going to do this by showing you a little vignette of a team of well-meaning students with a project that suddenly goes wrong. So we're going to read this vignette, and as we go through it, I want you to be thinking, what went wrong in this team? Please pause your video and read the short vignette of Rajit, Lauren, and Michael, who are excited to get started on a project for their engineering class. And here is the group the day that their proposal is due. Please read through it and, again, make a judgment about what went wrong with this team. Now, this group dynamic illustrates many of the problems that I was discussing before. Certainly, Michael and Lauren might perceive Rajit as a slacker who has turned in poor quality work or not done his fair share of the work. And they might very well be resentful that they had to rewrite his section of the report. Rajit might perceive his teammates as being domineering or as having excluded him from the work of the team by submitting something that he was not a part of. And certainly I think we can all see how all of these students are experiencing limited opportunities for learning on this project. So I'd like you to reflect again, what went wrong in this team? And you can probably identify multiple causes, but I'd like you to see if you can prioritize what is the single biggest thing that this team did wrong that led to this failed dynamic. Now, we characterize this group's biggest problem as variations of a failure to plan, and specifically a failure to plan around the collaborative writing aspects. In particular, there was no plan for how the team was going to review and offer feedback on each other's writing. There was no time budgeted for them to revise after getting this feedback. There was no discussion of how feedback would occur and what would happen afterwards. So I'd like to invite you to imagine a world where this group had planned. They would have had a timeline where they discussed and they provided time for each other to review and to revise. They would have talked about how they were going to make these revisions, and they would have even discussed what the document should look like before they started writing. Now, for years, I've tried to get students to plan their project. I would say this is the major lesson from my textbook on team writing. And I emphasize the importance of budgeting time for revision. I foregrounded these documents of task schedules, team charters, meeting agendas, provided horror stories of teams that didn't use them, and quotes from professionals who said, of course, use them. But when we surveyed students and asked them how often they use these documents, only 36% of students who said that when they were not required, they reported using a task schedule on their own, and only slightly higher reported using the team charter when not required to do so. The reasons for not using these documents were pretty predictable. Students said things like it seemed like it would take too much time, or we started it, but then we didn't update it, or it just didn't seem necessary because my teammates all seemed reliable. And even when students did use these documents, their documents were often very facile. They might look organized and seem to include milestones, but they overlook the complexities of revising and working together. This Gantt chart is an example of one of the task schedules that a team submitted. It's really nicely organizing, but it's missing the breakdown of roles and subtasks and important deadlines. There's not really any place in here for revising or giving each other feedback or times discussed when the group can meet to reassess, reevaluate their goals. Likewise, team charters were relatively facile. A team charter is intended to be a document where the group discusses how they will collaborate and the norms for working together as a group prior to engaging in the project. But students seem to think that they could just list universal rules for good behavior, and everyone on the team would know what these meant. They had a sort of right-wrong mentality. And if something went wrong or a teammate performed in a way that was not up to others' expectations, then that teammate was acting out of bad faith, as opposed to just understanding or having a misunderstanding that results from different expectations or values or ideas of what is normal and expected. So we see here a team agreeing that all team members will treat each other the way that they themselves would like to be treated, without any consideration that different people might have different ideas of how they would like to be treated. And in the bottom half of the screen, we see students assuming that if something goes wrong, it must be because someone was a bad actor, and not like it was in Rajit's scenario earlier, where there was a misunderstanding over what quality meant in this scenario. So based on these rather disappointing results from a workshop that in class was well received, but that students didn't follow through and didn't take up the lessons that we had presented. Based on this, we decided to redesign the workshop. And I'm going to have Maria take over from here.
Our flipped module consisted of two components, an at-home component as well as an in-class component. At home, students were required to complete two modules. Module 1 was the personal assumptions module, where students were asked to read and respond to the vignette about Rajit. Then they were asked to look at an alternative universe vignette where Rajit's team actually planned for their project and compare how the alternative universe was different. Then we asked students to begin reflecting on the things that they valued in teamwork. But what we did was we provided them with some scenarios to get them to start thinking about some common team conflicts that perhaps they might have already been familiar with, and also start thinking about the things that they would have done in those situations. And we focused on 4 key team aspects: team and personal goals, feedback and revision, values around time, and commitment levels, finding that these 4 were some of the critical aspects that students tend to overlook and that really influence the way that a team project plays out. And then finally, we asked students to begin unpacking their own expectations around some of those common value-based conflicts. To give you an example of what this might look like in Module 1, we gave students a scenario about timeliness, and this scenario reads as follows. Rajit and his team are scheduled to meet at 2 p.m. It's 2 p.m. and Rajit is in the room already. However, his teammates haven't shown up yet. We asked students to read this scenario and then to start thinking about what they would have done in that situation. And specifically, we asked at what point did they think that their peer was being inconsiderate when they showed up late to the meeting. Students answered the question, and then their answers along with their peers are all gathered together into one common shared repository that they can then look back on in the later modules. The second module that students completed at home was the task schedule module. And here is where we taught students about the task schedule strategy, and then we reviewed a sample task schedule that we created for Rajit's group. After students began to understand what were the different requirements for what are the different requirements for a task schedule, we then asked students to create their own task schedule, an individual version of a task schedule they would use for their own team projects. And we gave them a template to try to help guide some of that planning. Now, to give you an example of what this looks like, so this is a task schedule from the sample that we provided in Module 2. and it's for Rajit's group. And you'll notice that what we did here is we tried to illustrate to students some of the key aspects that we wanted them to focus on when creating a task schedule. And those include the different review points, such as the meeting and agenda, the different feedback points throughout the project, so the feedback and review points, and then the way that the students tracked the different stages of their drafts. And that's something that we hadn't seen in the past that was really important for us to include in this sample, so that students really began to incorporate those things into their project plans. After students look at the sample task schedule from Rajit's group, we provided students with a video that guide them more thoroughly on how to create a project plan, and then we asked them to create their own task schedules for their own teams that they would then upload and share with their teammates later on. And the idea being that students do a lot of the work of trying to unpack what they valued in the project and what they hope to achieve in the project before they come together with their team members. Now, Module 3 is where students then come together in their teams in class and begin sharing their ideas from Modules 1 and 2. So specifically, we ask students to compare their answers about team values and task schedules, the answers that they generated from the previous modules. And then we start prompting students to begin practicing compromising, a key team skill that students often lack. And what we did is we gave students some scenarios of Rajit and his team once again, and we provided them with some options on how the team can compromise within themselves. So how Rajit and his team can compromise on different scenarios. And what the students in class did is that they practiced with their team members on what were some of the compromises that they might select in order to help Rajit's team. And then we asked students to begin merging their own values in their own team charters and task schedules. And that's where they applied the compromising skills that they began to practice with Rajit's team into their own projects. So to give you an example of what this looks like, here we asked students to read a scenario for Rajit and his team, and the scenario reads as follows. Rajit and his teammates do not have the same attitudes towards time. For Rajit, who is the project manager, it's really important to be punctual and start meetings on time. For Michael and Lauren, it's important to have some flexibility around time. And then we ask students to begin compromising. What are some ways that Rajit and his group can compromise and integrate different time values into their team's culture? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. So this is where the students then pick an option on how they might compromise and help the team help Rajit's team compromise in this situation. And in doing so, we hope to prompt students to begin compromising in a more low-stakes situation with Rajit and his team so that they're more prepared to do it later on with their own team members. Now, this is where students are comparing and discussing their own values and their own preferences for the four key team components. So, for example, we asked students to recollect what they said about their preferences for timeliness, and then to discuss with their team members how they might either compromise or if there's an answer or a value that they all can agree on. But ultimately, the goal is for the team members to share their ideas and then to begin merging different perspectives together. Now, what we found from doing the flipped workshop is that students' use of task schedules increased quite significantly. It went from 36% of students using the task schedules unprompted in the original workshop to 75% in the flipped workshop. Likewise, we saw that there was a significant increase in the use of team charters, whereas only 38% of students in the original workshop used the team charters, were not required to do so. 73% ended up using the team charters after the flipped workshop. To give you an idea of what exactly the team charters also look like from after the flipped workshop, we saw an improvement along the following categories. First, teams took a much more nuanced approach to teamwork. They began paying attention to context much more than they had in the past. They also really emphasized creating a psychologically safe environment amongst their team that prioritized improvement, asking for help, and collaborating. And then we also saw that teams integrated different perspectives much more than they had in the past. And they really sought out mutually agreeable compromises, something that had not been present in the team charters in the past. And when we look at some of the discourse strategies that students use along those different improvement categories, we found the following. Students had much less punitive, universalist, and absolutist language in their charters, and instead they paid more attention to context and the different ways that team projects can ultimately be unpredictable. They also discussed those divergent perspectives that their team members brought to the table, and they valued those perspectives. They ended up validating the different things that their team members said and praised them for having different approaches. They also made many more attempts at compromise. And then finally, we saw a lot more use of hedging and also explanation for why certain decisions were made over others, which makes sense because if students are bringing in divergent perspectives and then making decisions according to those, they really need to have much more explanation as to why they chose one versus another, or why they ended up merging versus going with only one perspective. Now, some of the things that we saw in the team charters themselves, I wanted to point out some of the language more explicitly. So you'll notice that in the, so these are the examples that we saw earlier on in the teaching demonstration. Whereas before, students had a lot of that absolutist language, the universalist language, and that punitive language. In the post-flipped workshop, what we saw was that students compared different perspectives, and they really made an effort to document those different perspectives. And then when they came to a compromise, they really thought about what are some ways that they can integrate different perspectives and really accommodate different team members' needs. So for example, the team from the post-team charter number 6, they said H wants her team to achieve a good outcome that showcases dedication, engagement, and efficient teamwork, good communication, and relevant information. Whereas M wants her team to learn new issues related to the proposal and discussing effective and feasible solutions, alongside establishing clear goals and problems in the beginning. Hence, both H and M believe that the work should be thorough, including all the relevant information and setting a clear goal. So you'll notice that the students have similar goals that they want to achieve for their project, but they still made an effort to outline their specific needs and concerns for the project. And then for post-team charter number 21, what you'll notice here is that the students talk about much more, emphasize psychological safety much more in this version of feedback and revision than in the pre-team charters. And students also made an effort to make sure that they're accommodating the visions that different peers have for the project. So this excerpt reads, if feedback is confusing, ask the peer who gave the feedback for clarification so that the drafter can make proper revisions in the vision that the peer was thinking. The drafter makes the changes/revisions and then gets more feedback upon the changes in order to see if it matches the peer's vision. So there really is a push towards collaborative writing, and also to make sure that writers and revisers are attentive to the ideas that peers are bringing into a project. So I'd like to end by giving you some resources that you can take with you to your own classrooms. And specifically, you can find the modules that we created in the following link. It will provide the different Google forms that were used for the modules. And then our task schedule, the sample and template that we used for the students can be accessed with this link, but it is also found in Module 2 under the first document. And then also I want to provide you with the video that we created for students on how to make a task schedule. We hope that these resources will be really useful to you. Thank you very much, and if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.